Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. If you've been watching these videos for a while, you know that a major premise of every single video is that we can't read sections of the Gospels in isolation. We need to read them, first of all, in their immediate context, and then in the context of the entire Gospel. But more importantly, we need to view them through the lens of the Old Testament. We're going to look at an example of that today where it's so crucial that we see what's happening in the life of Jesus from this Hebraic perspective. It's John 2, verses 1 through 11. It's the first recorded miracle of Jesus when in Cana of Galilee he changes water into wine. Now what we're going to see as we work our way through these verses is that there's a possible allusion to the Joseph narrative where Pharaoh tells the Egyptians to do whatever Joseph tells them to do in this time of need. There's also references back to multiple texts in the Old Testament where you have the Messianic kingdom described as this time when there's going to be a profusion of the richest of wine. And there's several other Old Testament backgrounds to what's happening as well. Because when you work your way through these 11 verses, there are wedding motifs. There's the motif of the water purification jars. There's a temporal motif with the time designation right at the beginning of the story. And there's a lot of other things as well, which we will get to as we work our way through these verses. Let's start out by just seeing how the story begins in the opening two verses of John chapter 2. And then we'll talk a little bit about Cana of Galilee and this temporal reference of 3 days. So John 2, 1 through 2. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. Now, let's first of all talk about this third day. I took this from Ian Paul's article, Are the 6 Stone Jars in John 2 Historic or Symbolic? And you can see that at his website, which I have noted there. So if you work your way through the first couple chapters of John up to this first verse of John 2, there's multiple references to days. And as Ian has it designated here, you have day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 all lined up with especially various activities of John. So scholars disagree on exactly whether this is the 7th day or the 6th day. My predilection is to lean toward that this is happening on the 6th day so far in John's Gospel. Now, the reason that becomes significant is because when you view this story from the perspective of, for instance, the creation account, you see that day 6 is not only the day of Adam's creation, but it's also the day that he is joined to Eve. And so the very first wedding, as it were, takes place on day 6 of creation, which of course would fit perfectly with what's happening in John chapter 2 with this wedding celebration. Now, it says not on the 6th day, but explicitly the 3rd day. And as we've talked about in other videos, multiple times in the Old Testament especially, when big things happen, when God is going to do something big, it happens on the 3rd day. And that's a reason, for instance, Paul can say in 1 Corinthians 15 that Christ was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. Well, you can go back to the Old Testament, where there's no Messianic prophecy that says that the Messiah will be raised on the 3rd day. What Paul is referring to is this pattern of 3rd day activities of God where he accomplishes something great for his people. So when we read in John 2, chapter 1, that something is about to happen on the 3rd day, our ears should perk up. We're going to be waiting and watching for God to do something big on this 3rd day. And of course, he does. This is the first miracle, first sign that Jesus is going to give. Notice something else that's of interest here in the structure of John's gospel. So if you go back to chapter 1 of John, at the very end, this is where Jesus alludes to that event in the book of Genesis where Jacob sees the vision, has the dream vision of the ladder or the staircase with the angels of God ascending and descending upon it. Now, John 1 makes reference to that, and that connection is back to Genesis chapter 28. Now, in Genesis 29, what happens immediately after, what's recorded as happening immediately after Jacob's vision? A marriage. He gets married, first of all, to Leah. Of course, that's a trickery of his uncle Laban, but he marries Leah, and then after that wedding celebration is over, he marries Rachel. So we go from the dream vision of the angels going up and down to a marriage. Same thing happens here in John 1 and 2. Jesus makes an allusion back to that event in Genesis 28, and then immediately we proceed in John 2 into a wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. Now, where is Cana? You can see in your map here that it's located directly to the west, of the Sea of Galilee. It's kind of halfway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And it's probably about 9 miles north of Nazareth. So as you can see on your screen here, the Hebrew name is Cana, which means reed. Possibly there were some reeds in that area growing, and that led to the name. We're not for sure. But if the biblical Cana is to be identified with modern Quebec Cana, then it's 9 miles north of Nazareth. What else do we know about it? Well, we know that from John 21 that it's the hometown of Nathanael. And interestingly, it's in Jesus' conversation with Nathanael at the end of John 1 where he makes reference to the angels ascending and descending. So Nathanael is mentioned directly before the episode in Cana. So maybe there's a connection between those two. We do know also that Jesus not only performed his first, but also his second sign in Cana. First water into wine, and then in John 4, he heals the royal official's son. And from the Jewish historian Josephus, we know that Cana was used as a military staging ground for the beginning of that Jewish war against the Romans in the 60s AD. So those are some things we know about Cana. It's a small place. Most of these Jewish towns were extremely small, just a few acres, a few families. But strategically, as far as the biblical narrative goes, they're huge. So small in size, huge in importance. Now, one more thing before we move on to verses 3 and following. What do we know that's important to know about Jewish weddings? It's going to help us to understand what's happening in John 2. Well, the first thing is that unlike today, where you have a wedding and you have a celebration afterward, and then it's over. The bride and groom head off for the honeymoon. Everybody else works their way home. Didn't work that way in the first century Jewish culture. These wedding feasts would not last one, but several days. In the biblical narrative, back in Genesis and the book of Judges, we have 2 records of them lasting a week, 7 days, closer to when Jesus is performing this miracle in the 2nd century BC in the book of Tobit, which you might be familiar with from the Apocrypha. In the book of Tobit, we have reference to a wedding ceremony that lasted not 1, but 2 weeks. So either way, this is not going to be a one-day deal, and that's important to know because they have to have enough wine to last not just for 3 or 4 hours, but for days. Secondly, speaking of the wine, a wedding without wine in the 1st century would be like having a birthday party today without having a birthday cake. Everybody has a birthday cake. It's just assumed you're going to have that with a birthday celebration. So it was with wine at 1st century Jewish weddings. You needed to have wine. That was the celebratory drink among Jews, of course, just like it really still is today among us. And then thirdly, based upon what is recorded in John chapter 2, we know that it was the responsibility of the groom to provide the wine. Now that's going to become important in a minute because Jesus, at his mother's prompting, is going to step into the role of bridegroom. So it was the groom's responsibility to provide the wine. The wine begins to run out. Mary comes along and says, basically, Jesus, I need you to step into the role of groom. I need you to play the part of the bridegroom in providing wine for the wedding guest. More on that in just a minute. Let's first of all read these next few verses, John chapter 2, 3 through 5. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you, which of course is always good advice. Whatever Jesus tells you to do, do that. That's always the very best advice that you can receive. Now, what does that mean, though? Well, let's first of all talk about a couple of details that may bother you. For instance, why does Jesus refer to his mother not as mom or mother, but woman? Is this disrespectful? No, it's not disrespectful whatsoever. We know from multiple other occurrences in the Gospel of John that this was the way that Jesus addressed women in general. And we have one more reference to Jesus talking to his mother this way. So to the woman at the well in Samaria, Jesus says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming. To the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, Jesus stood up and said, woman, where are they? After everyone had, of course, left. Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And then at his crucifixion, John chapter 19, when Jesus sees his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And then to the disciple, behold your mother. And then one more in John 21:15, Jesus said to her, this is to Mary Magdalene, this is on the day of his resurrection, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? So it might sound strange to us. I never refer to my own mom as woman, but in this particular context, we have many other occurrences of Jesus addressing women, and of course, no way being disrespectful, just as woman. So don't let that kind of trip you up and make you think that Jesus is somehow not honoring his mother in his speech toward her. Then also, what does this mean when he says, what does this have to do with me, or something along those lines? Well, that is what's referred to as a Semitic expression. A Semitic phrase or expression is just simply means something which is derived from the Hebrew and then kind of transplanted wholesale into another language, in this case, Greek. Ti emoi kaisoi. In literal English, it would be what to me and to you. Ma li balak, ti emoi kaisoi, what to me and to you. Well, if you look at multiple other occurrences of this particular phrase in the New Testament as well as in the Septuagint of the Old Testament, seems to be a couple of different meanings that this can have. Meaning number one is basically, why are you bothering me unjustly? And you have a reference of that back in Judges 11, chapter 12. And this has a very negative cast to it. The other meaning is basically, why should I get involved? What business is this of mine? What does this have to do with me? And you have an example of that in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 13. So with the second of those, it seems to be the meaning here. What to me and to you? In other words, Jesus is telling Mary, why should I get involved? Why is this any of my business? And then he goes on to say, my hour or my time has not yet come. This quote is taken from the NET Bible First Edition notes, where they say, the Greek word translated as time, which is hora, occurs in John 2, the one we're looking at, John 4, 5, 7. You can see those other references up there. So a lot of other places in the gospel. It is kind of a technical reference. It's a reference to the special period in the life of Jesus when he was to leave this world and return to the Father, the hour when the Son of Man is glorified. So Jesus is telling her that my special time, when I do my special things, has not yet come. But he's going to go ahead and do it. His hour might not yet have come, and yet what he's going to do in this particular miracle is already give us a preview of actually what's going to happen at that very special hour that is to come. One other thing, this is taken from the book Jesus the Bridegroom, the greatest love story ever told, where the author writes that in a Jewish context, Mary is also asking Jesus to assume the role of the Jewish bridegroom. This is what I was referring to earlier. As New Testament scholar Adeline Farabach puts it, when the mother of Jesus says to Jesus, they have no wine, she places him in the role of the bridegroom, whose responsibility it is to provide the wine. So Mary's coming to Jesus, and she says they have no wine. Jesus says, well, what does this have to do with me? And then she goes and tells the servants, well, you do whatever he tells you, because Mary is assuming that Jesus is going to do what needs to be done to take care of the situation. Now, there is a possible allusion back to the book of Genesis in the whole Pharaoh Joseph context. So if you compare the Greek, which I won't read the Greek for you, but you can look at the Greek there if you know it, from John 2, chapter 5. The wine is gone. Mary says, do whatever Jesus tells you. Now, if you compare that with Genesis 41:55, this is during the famine. The 7 years of plenty get past. The 7 years of famine have begun. And Pharaoh says to the Egyptians, who of course are in need, they are in want, they're hungry, they're thirsty, they need that which they can't provide for themselves. Pharaoh says, whatever Joseph says to you, do. And the Greek there is very close between those two particular phrases, which is suggestive. I'm not saying that Mary in her head was thinking, oh, I'm like Pharaoh and Jesus is like Joseph. I'm saying that when we read what's happening in John 2 within the broader context of Scripture, It's pretty fascinating to compare these two situations and see how what Joseph did, what Pharaoh said Joseph would do, or how people should respond to Joseph, is now parallel to how Jesus says to the servants, do what this new and better Joseph, do what Jesus says to do. So, what does Jesus say to do? Let's see in these next few verses. This is going to be verses 6 through 10. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. Now, first of all, let me add that that's how we know it was the responsibility of the groom to provide the wine, because, of course, the master of ceremonies, as it were, comes to the groom and says this. Of course, the groom doesn't know anything about this, so it's a shock to him as it's a shock to the master as well. There's several details that we want to look at in this key section of John 2. So let's go through those one by one. First of all, the stone water jars. So if you go back to Leviticus chapter 11, verse 33, we know that if you had a vessel made out of pottery, then and if it became unclean, it had to be broken. It was no longer to be used. But stone vessels were free of these impurity laws. So these stone water jars were perfect for these purification purposes because they couldn't become unclean and therefore they wouldn't ever have to be broken. Secondly, they're for Jewish purification. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you read through Leviticus, you realize that the basic detergent, the basic ingredient for cleansing, for removing ritual impurity, was water. This is for male or female genital emissions. If a man has a seminal emission, if a woman's on her period, then they have about a day of uncleanness. For it's a woman on her period, 7 days of uncleanness. And afterward, basically, the ritual detergent, the means by which one moves from a state of unclean to clean, is simply by washing. So that's what the water jars were for. It was for these ongoing Jewish purification rites. They always needed water for this. Thirdly, how much did they hold? Well, the English translation I read, ESV, has 20 to 30 gallons. The Greek here is that they held 2 or 3 metretes, and a metretes was about 9 gallons. So each jar held 18 to 27 gallons. You do the math, you got 6 jars, total volume would be 108 to 162 gallons of wine. Now, that is about 2 bathtubs, 2 bathtubs full of wine. That is a lot of wine. That is more wine than certainly that they needed, more wine that they would have consumed. So this was a profusion, more than was necessary is what Christ was providing for them. And then finally, who is this master of the feast guy? Well, in Greek, it's the architriklenos, which translates into something like the president of a banquet. So he was the guy who was in charge of the food, the wine, etc. Kind of like a head waiter is one way that we might think of him. So why the wine? That's the question here. The water becomes wine, and it's tasted. It's not just wine, but it's this best wine that the master is unexpected to receive at this point in the feast, because everybody else, of course, gives the best wine first. Everybody gets a little bit tipsy, and then they bring out the less quality wine, because who cares once you've had your fill of wine. So it's reversed here. The best is saved for last. Why would wine be the perfect miracle for Jesus to perform? Why would this gift of wine be the perfect miracle for Jesus to perform? Because if you go back to the Old Testament, in particular the book of Isaiah, you're going to see that the gift of wine in great quantities and in great quality is a sign that the Messianic kingdom has arrived. This actually has its roots all the way back in the book of Genesis. If you look at the blessing of Jacob over his 12 sons, he talks about the Messianic kingdom being this time when there's just no lack of wine. We're not going to look at that Genesis 49 text. We're going to look at Isaiah, but it begins already back in the book of Genesis. So if you go to Isaiah 24, this is the description of creation in need of God's activity, creation in need of God to send his Son to renew creation. And Isaiah 24, 7, 9, and 11 uses that language of a lack of wine. The wine mourns, the vine languishes. No more do they drink wine with singing. There's an outcry in the streets for lack of wine. All our joy has grown dark. So it's this picture of this need for wine. So there's a deprivation. There's a lack. So what does God do? Well, if you go to the very next chapter, Isaiah 25, God provides that which is needed. This is a famous reading often connected with Easter. This is a picture of the Messianic feast. Isaiah 25, 6 through 8. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine. This isn't the cheap stuff. This is the best stuff. Rich food, full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. And then he goes on to describe how God will swallow up this pall of death that has covered all peoples. And then if you go to a Jewish text from the end of the 1st century AD, it's called 2nd Baruch, we also have this same language used of the Messianic kingdom being this place where wine is in abundance. 2nd Baruch 29 says, when the anointed one, when the Messiah will begin to be revealed, the earth will also yield fruits 10,000-fold. And one branch will produce 1,000 clusters, and one cluster will produce 1,000 grapes, and one grape will produce a core of wine. So it's this idea that from one little grape, you're going to have this profusion of wine, and every vine is just going to be laden with this miraculous amount of grapes to be used for the making of wine. Of course, you get the message. When there's a ton of wine, that means the Messiah has come. He's going to bring joy. He's going to bring celebration. He's going to bring that which his people need in order to rejoice at this feast, because he's come to bring about a new creation for the people of God. Now, one more verse in this particular part of John 2, verse 11. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, in John's gospel, the manifestation of the glory of God is something you don't expect. In John's gospel, the revelation of the manifestation of the glory of God happens not where you would expect it. You would expect it maybe at his transfiguration or certainly at his resurrection. But for John's gospel, the glory of God is revealed when Jesus is lifted up on the cross. So John says, this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, changing water into wine, and manifested his glory. So what's the connection here between this first of glorious signs and the last, the ultimate sign of the glory of God in the cross of Christ? Well, I think it's this. Here he takes simple water. Well, he takes this water that was used for Jewish purification rites, this plain water, this ordinary water, and he transforms it into something which you never would have expected, into the richest of wines. Just like he will take his death upon the cross, crucified like a common criminal, put to death in this most horrific of ways, and he will transform that into the very revelation of the glory of God, of his love for us. So something common and simple and everyday and something you wouldn't have expected is going to produce that which is unexpected. Water into wine, this crucifixion into the glorification, into the presentation, manifestation of the glory of God. Let's see if we can pull all of this together. So on this momentous third day in Cana of Galilee, so this big third day when God is going to do something great, on this momentous third day in Cana of Galilee, what did Jesus do? Well, he reveals himself as the new and better Joseph, who provides for his people who are in need. So Pharaoh said, do whatever Joseph says. Mary says, do whatever Jesus says. In both cases, a provision is made for those who are in need. And as the Messianic bridegroom who transforms simple water used in the past for purification into a profusion of the richest of wine, that his people might celebrate this earthly wedding as the image of the wedding feast of the crucified Lamb, whose kingdom has no end. And that is what happens in John chapter 2. We have this simple water from these Jewish purification jars, which Jesus now takes and he makes into something which is a sign of his kingdom. So we move from the old to the new. We move from Joseph to Jesus. We move from the promise of the Messianic kingdom to the arrival of the Messianic kingdom. We move from want to provision. We move from water that's connected with the old covenant, that's connected with purification in Leviticus, and now this becomes wine, which is a symbol of the arrival of this Messianic kingdom, the new covenant, in which we are now participants, in which we now rejoice with Christ in the ongoing feast at his supper. So that's John 2, 1 through 11. I hope that this Old Testament background has shed light on a number of those particular parts of John 2. I hope that you're all doing well, and I look forward to covering more gospel lessons in the coming weeks. May God's peace, grace, and mercy be yours in abundance. We'll see you next week.